Probably in terms of writing and linguistic awareness, they were a combination, firstly, of W's, P.G. Wodehouse, Oscar Wilde, and Evelyn Waugh, the British novelist. That's a male Evelyn, by the way. And I would add to that Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. When I was between the ages of about 7 and 12, I was obsessed with Sherlock Holmes, and I would read and reread and reread all those. So the rhythms and tones of the English language, as exemplified by that kind of grand, perfect Victorian manner, and then Dickens. But it was really Oscar Wilde who awoke language in my head in a way like nobody else. And I think also discovering the kind of man Oscar Wilde was an enormous influence as well. The fact that you could be such a towering intellect, such a lord of language, and be charming and graceful, kind, good-natured, but also unhappy and unlucky, was a great discovery for an adolescent, because one of the traps of adolescence is the sort of paranoid resentment that somehow you're never going to match up, and that everybody else's life is going to be better and finer and fuller, that everyone else attended some secret lesson in which how to live was taught, and you had a dental appointment that day, or you were somehow not invited. And the point of great writers like Wilde is that they make that invitation to you. They welcome you. Perhaps the greatest definition, I think, of character and quality is people who, when they're truly great, rather than making you feel that tall, they make you feel that tall. That their greatness, as it were, improves you. They used to say of Oscar Wilde that when you got down from a dinner table, you felt funnier and wittier and cleverer. Now, a lot of brilliant people make you feel less funny, less clever, less witty, because they're so clever, witty, and funny. But he had the opposite effect. A bit like what Shakespeare said about Falstaff. Not just a wit, but a cause of wit in others. Philosophy is an odd thing. When we use the word in everyday speech, you sometimes hear it hilariously. They say, it's never good to be late. That's my philosophy. You think that's a generous ascription of that rather dull precept to call it a philosophy. But it's odd how philosophers, generally speaking, at least the ones I've read or the ones I value, don't have, in that sense, a philosophy. There is no particular Socratic or Nietzschean or Kantian way to live your life. They don't offer ethical codes and standards by which to live your life. They don't offer a philosophy to follow. They just simply raise an enormous number of questions, mostly. So in the sense that you put the question, is there a philosopher that's important to me? Well, I loved really the sort of Bertrand Russell grand sort of tour of philosophy, the history of philosophy from the pre-Socratics, as they're called, Zeno and so on, through to Socrates and Plato and then Aristotle. I never quite liked Aristotle. I think that's partly, although he was obviously a genius and a brilliant, and he invented logic, so what's not to like? I think it was his influence on the medieval mind was probably rather pernicious and unfortunate, and all those categories and things. But when it opened up with, I suppose, Spinoza but then Kant really in the Enlightenment era. Oh, and actually Locke, I did like Locke. He was a fine philosopher. But they don't, I mean, what's so great about them is that they just, they're quite scary when you think of the word philosopher, and especially if it's logic and symbolic logic, and you get onto Hegelian philosophy. It's incredibly difficult to read, I find, and you follow for about, it's like trying to grab a salmon, you know. The harder you clutch at it, the more it slips out of your hand, and whoa, it's gone, and you chase it again, and what was that? And you feel very stupid. But I think the beauty of questioning and simplicity that you get from Kant in particular, I think, is just amazing, because it's like they say of simple mathematical laws, you know, that make fractals. The tiniest little elegant observation about or question about something just spins out these immensely complex things that make you rethink everything. So yes, I think philosophy is a really important dimension, but I think in our age we tend to be rather sloppy about it. We either think Buddhism is philosophy, which, you know, or some sort of Eastern thing about being nice and spiritual, and that'll do, which is fine. I mean, you know, obviously I believe in kindness and niceness and lots of spiritual things, but the real intellectual rigor and quest of logic is something that I'm afraid takes incredibly hard work, and we live in an age in which hard work is, if not actively deprecated or denigrated, it is run away from or ignored. It's sort of, people frown at you and say, well, that's a bit dull and stupid. Why can't we just short circuit it and talk about, like, spirit? Well, yeah, you can say spirit, but if you think that's philosophy, and if you think that's good enough, the most important philosophy, I think, is that even if it isn't true, you must absolutely assume there is no afterlife. You cannot for 1 second, I think, abrogate the responsibility of believing that this is it. Because if you think you're going to have an eternity in which you can talk to Mozart and Schopenhauer on a cloud and learn stuff and, you know, really get to grips with knowledge and understanding, and so you won't bother now, I think it's a terrible mistake. It may be that there is an afterlife and I'll look incredibly stupid, but at least I would have had a crammed pre-afterlife, a crammed life. So to me, the most important thing is, you know, as Kipling put it, you know, to fill every 60 seconds with, no, what is it? To fill every unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, you know, absolutely. So that's all I'm saying, I suppose, is that there's no point wasting time being lazy. Though, of course, indolence in a divine way, axidy, has its advantages. Oh, shut up, Steve. Okay, next one. It's interesting. Atheism comes in for rather a bad press, and I suppose I'd rather describe myself as a humanist. I don't believe in God. I don't believe there is a God. If I were to believe in a God, I would believe in gods. I think monotheism is the really ghastly thing. That is the absolutely staggering, to me, misapprehension. I can perfectly see why anybody might imagine that each thing that grows, each phenomenon that accompanies us on our journey through life, the sky, the mountains, spirits of nature, I can imagine why man would wish to endow them with an inner something, an inner animus that they would call the god of that thing. I can see that. It's a beautiful and charming way of looking at it, and I can understand the Greek idea that there are these, you know, these principles of lightning or of war or of wisdom, and that to embody them, to personify them into Athena or Ares or whichever god you want, makes enormous sense. But to say that there is one only God who made it all and who is, you know, that is just, what? Why? Who said? Where? Come on. And I love how when people watch, I don't know, a David Attenborough or a Discovery Planet type thing, you know, where you see the absolute phenomenal majesty and complexity and bewildering beauty of nature, and you stare at it, and somebody next to you goes, and how can you say there's no God? Look at that. And then 5 minutes later, you're looking at the life cycle of a parasitic worm whose job is to bury itself in the eyeball of a little lamb and eat the eyeball from inside while the lamb dies in horrible agony. And then you turn to them and say, yeah, where is your God now? You know? I mean, you can't just say there's a God because the world is beautiful. You have to account for bone cancer in children. You have to account for the fact that almost all animals in the wild live under stress with not enough to eat and will die violent and bloody deaths. There is not any way that you can just choose the nice bits and say that means there is a God and ignore the true fact of what nature is. The wonder of nature must be taken in its totality, and it is a wonderful thing. It is absolutely marvelous. And the idea that an atheist or a humanist, if you want to put it that way, doesn't marvel and wonder at reality, at the way things are, is nonsensical. The point is we wonder all the way. We don't just stop and say, that which I cannot understand I will call God, which is what mankind has done historically. That's to say, God was absolutely everything 1,000 or 2,000 years ago because we understood almost nothing about the natural world. So it could all be God. And then as we understood more, God receded and receded and receded. So suddenly now he's barely anywhere. He's just in those things we don't understand, which are important. But I think it just is such an insult to humanity. And the Greeks got it right. The Greeks understood perfectly that if there were divine beings, they are capricious, unkind, malicious mostly, temperamental, envious, and mostly deeply unpleasant. Because that you can say, well, yes, all right, if there's going to be God or gods, then you have to admit that they're at the very least capricious. They're certainly not consistent. They're certainly not all-loving. I mean, really, it's just not good enough, is it? You know, if we empower ourselves with responsibility over our actions, responsibility over our destinies, and responsibility for directing and maintaining and creating our own ethical and moral frameworks, which is the most important thing, really, isn't it? Because perhaps the greatest insult to humanism is this idea that mankind needs a God in order to have a moral framework. There's a very clear way of demonstrating logically how absurd that is, because the warrant for that logical framework, for that moral framework that comes from God, is always tested against man's own morals. It's a complicated argument, but I mean that's, you know, it's the standard one, which is pretty unanswerable. But the idea that that we don't know right from wrong, but we have to take it from words put down in a book 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago and dictated to rather hot-headed, neurotic desert tribes, is just insulting. It's just, no, I mean, you know, if there were a God, he would want us to be better spirited than to take his word for everything. You know, wouldn't he? If he gave us free will, would he really want us to say, no, I have to abide by everything that's written in this book? All the laws of circumcision and of eating and of what to do with menstruating women, I'm going to obey those written down there. I won't think for myself because that's not required of me. Come on. It's just not good enough. And you know, I have no quarrel with individuals who are devout and who have faith. I don't want to mock them. I really don't. But damned if I'm going to be told by them what to do with my body, or damned if I'm going to have the extraordinary battles won by enlightenment over the past 400 years, to have those battles abnegated by a new dark ages. It's the, you know, the battle lines must be drawn. Music in its time, but I mean that's a function of history. You know, the fact is that the composers always write for power, or power and money, and it so happened that in the period when polyphony all the way through to the classical and early romantic era, all the power and the money was with the church. So some great masses and some great choral music and some great oratorios were written, from obviously the Baroque age being the sort of pinnacle of that, but all the way through to the Mozart's final works, his Requiem and Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, and you know, and Mendelssohn and so on. There have been some marvelous religious works, and in painting similarly. But that's because these were princes. They were princes of the church. They were prince archbishops who employed Mozart. These were not spiritual beings who inculcated these composers with the sense of the divine that makes the music divine. The glory of Verdi's Requiem or Mozart's Requiem or Bach's pieces is that they are fantastically, incredibly human. And like all great human things, they reach for the infinite. They reach for beauty. A religious person would call that the divine. You could call it the numinous, you could call it anything else, but certainly that religion has been good for that, and good for architecture, because it has required enormous buildings for the shepherding of people in order to do the services, and they spend a lot of money on it, and so they're rather glorious buildings. You've got to hand them that. Did they make the trains run on time? No, they didn't do that. That's about it, really. No, and there are some kind individual people. I mean, very kind people who give to the poor and look after the sick and so on. But it's not necessary and sufficient as a justification for religion, because there are plenty of people who are not religious who are also kind to the sick and good to the poor and care about people's well-being. Yes, oh, very much so. I mean, Trevor Huddleston and Archbishop Tutu from South Africa are two good examples who were both genuine men of their church, or obviously Huddleston is dead, but Tutu's still alive, and who both fought a terrible injustice and used all the authority of their position amongst their believers, but very bravely spoke out, sometimes against the wishes of the church hierarchies. Some liberation theologians who've, some of them mad communists, some of them just decent liberals who fought against the hideous doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, for example. And there are individual voices who are raised in conscience against the bureaucracy and the dogma and the doctrine of the churches. And, certainly, of course, individuals Bonhoeffer, for example, in Germany, the Lutheran minister who spoke out against Hitler. Of course, they've been good and fine religious people, and the Dalai Lama seems rather charming. I don't know. It's terrible. I don't want to come over as some terrible anti-ecclesiastical figure, but. No. I came from what on the surface would have looked like a very typical English family, in as much as, I say typical, one that an American might regard as typical. It was a country house with gardeners and nice staff, and it looked rather grand. And I was sent away at the age of 7 to a prep school, which is in England is from 7 to 13 is a prep school, and sent away to boarding school 200 miles from home. And that's was a very traditional English, what you might call upper class, upper middle class sort of education, where I received a very classical education. My parents were marvellously educated people. They're both university educated, both brilliant scholars in their own way. My father a physicist, my mother a historian, but not absolutely typical of the class, because my mother's family is Jewish, Eastern European Jewish, and she was actually born in Britain, but her sister was born in the family area, which is now Slovakia, but which was Hungary and indeed for a short time Czechoslovakia. And so there was that sort of mixture, that rather exotic mixture, the mother's family of people who talked about food, which is a very un-English thing to do back in the 60s when I was growing up, and who had that kind of exotic accent and all those things. But they weren't Judaic, they weren't religiously Jewish, they were just proud to be Jewish Jews, and there were plenty of them in Israel. Those who had survived the Holocaust were in Israel, or mostly in America. And so, in that sense, it was an idyllic childhood. If you love me looking at the house and looking at how lucky we were, it looks fantastic. But of course, the childhood is what goes on inside your head, nothing to do with what goes on outside. So it was the usual sticky mess of adolescent Sturm und Drang. Always closest to my mother, because my mother is an extraordinarily warm and unbelievably friendly and lovable person. People are genuinely astounded by her positivity. She's just the most smiling person people will have met. And so that, obviously gave closest warmth. And my father was rather remote. I thought of him, I wrote about this in my autobiography, that I thought of him as Sherlock Holmes. He was similarly a deeply rational man, unbelievably brilliant, because of his physics and his mathematics, and also music. As a young boy, he was a chorister at St Paul's Cathedral, and he played the piano beautifully, and his musical understanding is very fine. But a sort of great intellectual rigor. He seemed to us as children, to my brother and my sister and myself, as quite cold and quite forbidding, quite frightening. He worked incredibly hard. He worked at home. The stable block of the family house, which was a very large stable block indeed, he'd converted to his laboratories where he worked, and so he you know, we never had the pleasure of him being out of the house, and or he was inside the house in his study working, you know, and we never quite knew where he was, and if we made a noise we felt the sort of thunder rumbling. So he was quite a scary man. Now of course I'm very easy in fine terms, but it was a difficult thing. What makes a good family? Well, I suppose, well, obviously love. Love lubricated often, I think, by humour. I think a family that can laugh at each other and that tease themselves and who are able to be jolly with each other, I think is the key. Humour is, you know, like a dog's tongue, or a dog's nose rather, it should be cold and faintly wet, and a vet will tell you that's a sign of a healthy dog. I think our equivalent of a cold, wet nose is humour. Families where there's not much laughter, I think, are signs of some sort of dysfunctionality or sickness. Maybe if there's too much laughter, it's dysfunctional too. Who knows? Families are so different. I've never met anyone who says that they come from they thought they lived in a normal family. As children, everyone thinks their family is weird and they're upset by the weirdness of their own family. It is a peculiar thing we're asked to do. That I think G.K. Chesterton put it, that it is an onerous responsibility that, having been dropped by the stork down a random chimney and unwrapped, we are invited to get on with the set of strangers who peer down at us. I mean, because although yes, we share the DNA, you know, they are physically of our flesh and we are of their flesh. Nonetheless, we didn't choose them. They are a set of strangers. There's this man here, and we should call him Daddy, and there's this woman here, we should call her Mummy. This girl here, I should call my sister, and this boy here, I should call my brother, and we are somehow bonded for life. I remember making an absolute, well, I won't say fool of myself. I was expelled from a meeting of Latter-day Saints when I first went to Salt Lake City. I just literally, as a tourist, I was wandering around, and this person in a grey shift came up to me and said, "Would you like to see around?" And I said, "Well, that's very kind." And then she started gathering others, and I realised she was a Mormon who was doing a tour, and presumably there was a little bit of recruitment going along, because they're a very proselytising sect, as you know, the Mormons. Anyway, but she gave us a good tour, and we saw this tabernacle here and this here and so on. And then at one point she said, "I just want to tell you a little about the Church of Latter-day Saints." And we all politely stood. And then she said how in the afterlife all families will be reunited, and you'll be with your families forever. So I put my hand up and said, "But what happens if you've been good?" She said, "Could you leave, please?" Because everyone started laughing. But I mean, what a ridiculous idea. How is that supposed to be attractive? That you're going to be stuck with every aunt and every cousin and every, oh, good gracious, every, you know, alcoholic or slightly deviant uncle. I mean, Jesus, it's just the most awful destiny imaginable. And they think that's a USP. That's what our church promises. Good Lord. Well, of course, what it does, you don't have to be that smart to spot, is what it does is that church focuses entirely on women d'un certain âge, as the French say, women of a certain age, who have lost their children because they've grown up, and who've lost their parents because they've died, and they're lonely, and they've still got that family queen bee mother nesting instinct, and they're the ones the Latter-day Saints home in on and say, "You follow us and we promise you that you'll be your family all around you again in heaven." And they think that's a cool thing. Everyone else would go, "Ah!" Anyway. I say, and I think it's true, that for me the first moment with Oscar was language. I was youngish, 11ish, 12ish, too young really to be entirely sure of my sexuality, of what that sexuality meant. I think I've always been aware of my sexuality, but I never quite knew what it meant. But so that side of him we'll come on to. But firstly it was language, and I remember there's a line of Algernon's in The Importance of Being Earnest, and I was watching the Puffin Asquith film of The Importance of Being Earnest, and Algernon says to Cicely, "Would you be in any way offended if I said that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection?" And I leaned forward, and there were no videos and instant pauses on TiVo in those days, and I replayed it in my brain. You'd be offended if I said that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection. And I thought, how unbelievably beautiful. The swing, the balance, the rhythm, how clever to make a sentence that's all full of Latinate words ending in ation, to make that sing and poetical. Because mostly in the English language, the words that are lyrical and beautiful are not words like the personification. They're rather technical, clumpy words. But just simply by colliding them together, it's funny and beautiful and breathtaking. And I'd known that you could use language to say, can I be excused, I need to go to the men's room. I knew that you could use language to say, I want some more. I knew that language had that function. But the idea that it could be used to dance, that it could be used to delight, that it could be used to enthrall quite so magnificently was new to me. So I read, we had, right in the country, the library would come and visit us. It was what's called a mobile library. It's like a big van, and it would come about, half a mile from the house and walk down a country lane to where it used to stop, and it would get in, and that's where I get all my books. So I said, do you have any Oscar Wilde? And they said, yes. I said, I want a play called The Importance of Being Earnest. And they said, yes, I think we've heard of that one. And then they get it to me, and I'm saying it's there in front of me. And I read it, and I kind of learn the whole play off by heart. I mean, I can still to this day. Did you hear what I was playing on the piano just now? I didn't think it polite to listen, sir, and so on. That's how the play begins. I'm sorry for that, for your sake. I don't play the piano well. Anyone can play the piano well, but I play with wonderful expression, and so on. Anyway, I just became obsessed. And then I saw a biography by a man called Montgomery Hyde of Wilde, so I read the biography, and this is where it all changed, because not only was this man, as I said before, a lord of language, it's a phrase of his own, actually, of his own, but he was, if you like, a kind of secular messiah, a bohemian prince of the most fantastic power and beauty and grace and gravity, and he collected friends, and he looked at the world and he showed you the true colours of things as no one had. And on top of that, he shared what I knew instinctively was my sexual preference of my own kind. And not only that, but it caused, of course, him the most appalling suffering. He was despised and rejected of men in the most terrible way. And then when I read De Profundis, the letter he wrote to Lord Alfred from Reading Jail, I think it was perhaps one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. Now, of course, like a lot of people in my generation, that meant I grew up with a sense of doom being allied to sexuality. That there were no literature and biography offered no examples of happy endings for homosexual people. Gay wasn't used then. So I had an immense and obvious sense of the fact that my life would be doomed, would be fatal, and would probably end in prison or in shame and something horrible. But the knowledge that I would be joining Oscar Wilde, and then after that, of course, through bibliographies, you find out other people, Andre Gide or whoever, Michelangelo. I would be joining a kind of Olympia of fabulous men and women who were better than others. They had a special insight. They vibrated at art and beauty with a sort of greater frequency and gave off a more wonderful harmonic than most people did. And so I was proud to be an elect, even if it was a doomed elect. That was my sentimental and adolescent, I suppose, response to my sexuality. I can't imagine how different it would have been if I'd been born 20 years later and into a world of the internet and much more open things. I'm sure it would have been a lot less doom-laden, but I suspect I would have read a lot less literature, and I would have been a lot less interested in the intellect and the life of the mind. I would have been much more interested in just getting my rocks off, I suppose, because it would have been easier to do so, I guess. I would have been felt less guilty for so long. There are compensations, though, for the era in which I grew up, and that is, as I say, the fellowship of literature. Yes, I never thought, of course, when I grew up loving Wilde and collecting his books and even trying to collect early editions, that I would one day play him on screen. It was simply unthinkable, but it did come to pass. I became aware as I entered my 30s that it was just being, shall we say, was disposed to the adipose. I was getting a little plump. That I could, if I grew my hair, look a little like him. And although that is completely irrelevant basis on which to be qualified to play someone, it just sets the thing in your mind. And the English playwright Alan Bennett once stopped me in Joe Allen's in London, just as he was passing the table. And he said, "I was looking at you from across the room, and it suddenly occurred to me, you look terribly like Oscar, you know. You should play him one day." And I thought, and I looked in the, I went to the gents and I looked in the mirror and I thought, gosh. And I didn't really think much more of it. And occasionally people would use that tediously predictable phrase, "born to be wild." And then suddenly I was approached by Julian Mitchell, the writer, and Brian Gilbert, the director, and Mark Samuelson, the producer, who had this project, and saying, would I play Oscar Wilde? And it was just overwhelming. And what was even more overwhelming was they had as a consultant this wonderful, charming man called Merlin Holland, who was Oscar's grandson, who was younger than Wilde was when Wilde died. And that connects us to it. It just so happens that Wilde's younger son, Vivian Holland, married very, very late and had a very late child, and hence Wilde's grandson lived, you know, as I say, was in 100 years after Wilde was Wilde's age, which is rare. So anyway, that seemed so exciting and marvelous, and I prepared it. I read as much as I could, of course, but nothing can prepare you for the, I don't know, every day getting up and worrying about whether or not you're going to let him down. I mean, the one thing I was absolutely determined was that that Wilde was not just a sort of epigram factory, just a machine for spouting bon mots and witticisms in a camp, brittle, peacocky manner, going, "Oh, how too utterly utter." That everyone who described him described the mellow gravity of his voice, the seriousness with which he looked into your eyes, which is what made him so funny, because he, you know, everything he said was said as if it was absolutely true. So when it was a dazzling paradox or a marvellous aphoristic turn of phrase, literal turn of phrase, you know, where the thing is inverted, you know, like, you know, work is the curse of the drinking classes. He didn't say it in inverted commas as if he knew it were a joke. He said it as if he had just seen it as a truth. And that made it funnier, but it was also part of his whole manner, is that there was a direct simplicity about him, not an arch campness, which is... So even if I was hopeless, I hoped the one thing I could set straight about Wilde was that. So that was a heck of a feeling. Another side to him is, of course, naturally people think of him as a gay martyr and a gay icon and a gay symbol for the age, but he was a marvellous father until he wasn't, until, of course, he created such a scandal, or it was embroiled in such a scandal that obviously it was disastrous for his family, and that betrayal was not a piece of good fatherhood. But while he was a father, he was a kindly father, a loving father, and he created one of the greatest gifts to children that there ever was, which is his fairy stories, which I don't think are well known enough. I think they rank absolutely with the Grimm fairy stories and the Hans Christian Andersen fairy stories. They're marvellous tales. They have all his qualities and something extra. Greatness of heart and a beauty and a charm and an amazing, I think the word is proleptic, a sort of prophetic vision almost of what suffering and pain and sacrifice he would go through, although they were written at the height of his happiness and his riches and his popularity. There is a sort of doom in the way the stories play out, which is quite staggeringly, as I say, proleptic. I suppose, I mean, yes, Wilde teaches as much that even from 120 years in the past seems as true as ever it was. He wrote marvellously in his essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, about the press. In medieval times, they had the rack. Now we have the press. I think he predicted really quite brilliantly the enormous growth of the press, the impertinence of the press, how wrong it was that the emphasis on the press was on the individual lives of private people rather than on sharing truth and beauty and innovation. And I'm afraid I don't really enjoy the press at all. I like to know what's going on in the world, but that's a very small part of what the press delivers. So I haven't read a newspaper for 15 years, I think 12 years certainly, certainly not a British one. I just don't, and I find I get on with them without them incredibly well. It is actually not just that it makes me less unhappy, it actually makes me actively happier. It's as if some huge weight is rolled off me not to read the opinions of others. And I can quite understand why others wouldn't want to read the opinions of me, and they don't have to. And that's the beauty of it. Is let's not. But there is a sort of, I think, what Wilde understood, but there's a sort of furious anger in a certain class of journalists that they're not being heard, even though they have access to every one of their readers. The fact that someone else isn't listening or isn't paying attention drives them slightly potty, and they actually want to bellow their malice into the ear of the person to whom it's directed. And if they felt that person wasn't getting it, it would really annoy them, because they want to hurt. They actually want to hurt people. And that's unfortunate. I just don't want to be a part of it. And the thing was, I was a part of it. I'm really not speaking of some giant noble spirit who is easily wounded and must be, must be sympathised with. I was a journalist or at least a columnist, which is what my objections. I had no objection with news gatherers. I was a columnist for several years for the Daily Telegraph in England, which is the most successful sells the most copies, at least, of the broadsheets of the serious newspapers. And I could see how easy it was to become this poisoned figure, because there's nothing easier than writing an article against something. It's just so simple. It writes itself. You've just got to be angry about something. You've just got to puff and wheeze with indignation and fury and resentment and bile and malice, and the thing writes itself. And if you write anything that's for something, it looks sentimental and cutesy and so much harder to write. It's so much harder to write well. So all the successful columnists, certainly in British press, are vicious, and they're good at being vicious, and it's admirable. And if you share their politics, mostly their viciousness is something you can applaud. If you don't, then you just call them beasts and animals and revolting, and it just gets so annoying. It's such a pity. And that's one of the reasons I love the online world, is that although that exists in abundance, you can choose absolutely which part of the online world you want to live in. You can make your own kingdom in that sense. So things like Twitter or whatever, I'm sure there are all kinds of Twitter, clusters of people who have politics that I would find horrific, and religious views that I would find preposterous and impertinent. But I just don't have to follow them, and I can block them, and I will never know they exist, and that's glorious. And similarly, as long as you don't lower your eyes when reading a blog, as long as you don't go down to the comment section where the trolls lurk, where the viciousness is, because that's, there really is just suppurating, boiling seas of acid, where if you just so much as dip a toe, you've lost your limbs, just vileness abounding. Again, it's this resentment. I will be heard, and not only will I be heard, I will offend, I will tear, I will lacerate, I will wound. I want the sensibilities of anyone who disagrees with me to be bruised beyond mending. That kind of attitude is very strong on the net, and for all that we can be advocates for the glory and the democracy that exists online, we must be aware too that dark side of humanity that just needs to be heard and can't bear people like me, for example, who have access to greater numbers of followers on Twitter, or whose website gets more hits. And the more they see that, the more the web becomes a reflection of their view of the meanness and wrongness of society, where some people get it all and others get none, then the more bitterness there is. And I think it's difficult, because I don't certainly want there to be an aristocracy on the net. I don't want there to be that. I think that the whole beauty of it at its best is that there is genuine equality and genuine reciprocity between a Twitterer and his or her followers, or between a blogger and their readers, and that it's not an audience going to one site that is permanent and stable and is like the equivalent of the old models of the broadcaster, but that it's much more fluid, and the broadcaster becomes the broadcasted to. The TV station becomes the audience. And as long as people believe that and behave as if that's true, then there's real hope in the way information is going. Who was my first love? Well, I shan't give you his name, because that's unkind. And he's married and has children, and I wouldn't want to embarrass his children. But I've given him various names in novels and in books. like a lot of first loves, certainly first loves for sensitive people such as I was then, and I guess I have what Martin Amis called the primary writer's arrogance of assuming that my experiences are common to everyone else's experiences. Sometimes it is true. Mostly one hopes it's true, and therefore that's what one likes in a writer. You think, oh, I feel that too. Just occasionally you might express a feeling and everyone goes, what? Then it's very embarrassing. But I'm assuming that most people, their first love when they're a teenager, that unbelievable hole that opens up inside them of longing and yearning, of pain, of joy, that huge, great bundle of toxic emotions allied to beauty and opening out into nature and to glory and suddenly connecting you with every love poet and every love song ever written, that explosion in my head and heart will never be matched. You can never hope to recapture the first fine careless rapture, as the poet put it. But it stays with you, like a good acid trip. You get a little flashback every now and again. It'll never leave you. It teaches you to look at things differently and to feel things differently. It educates your soul, if you like. All first love is unrequited, ultimately, because it's so huge. It's such an act of giving, and it requires so much back that it can never be given back. And indeed, you wouldn't necessarily want it given back. It is like an atom bomb. It is like all the energy of who you are and who you want to be and what you love and what you hope to be explodes, and it is impossible for a single human being to offer that back to you in a mutual way. It would be like matter meeting antimatter. It's sort of almost important that what you do is worship and yearn and long. But so that was, to me, of course, the single most important thing in my life. And occasionally I get dreams and I'm back there again, and I'm still as trembly as ever I was. And I get, because I've written about it, I get emails and Twitters, whatever, from people in their adolescence who are going through the same thing and saying, oh, how do I cope? And I read your book and it's the same for me, and it is the same for me, and he'll never look at me, she'll never look at me. What can I do? I'll make a fool of myself. Should I write them a poem? And what if they reject me? And oh my God. And I read that and I also weep at these vast sagas, these romantic sagas that are played out in every school, in every village, in every town, in every country in the world it's going on. There's all this massive emotional energy just spreading outwards, and some of it ends terribly unhappily. So, the only thing that saddens me is that I suppose the default community attitude of kids is to suppress it and to smother it and to pretend it isn't there and to be ashamed of it. Not because it's transgressive, because it's gay necessarily. It's just as problematical if it's straight. It's nothing to do with that. But because the schoolyard attitude is that you don't talk about these things. There's no, you feel all this emotion, but the language for it is forbidden. Really, you just don't do it. Unless, I think girls are probably better at it, and maybe the online community helps with it. Chat rooms and things, you can express yourself. But generally speaking, boys at 15 and 16 are much more interested in sport, or even if they're not more interested in sport and their soul is yearning, they're not going to say it. And if only they could, it would be good. I suppose ask whether you're looking to be loved or to love, or whether you really do, because I think, the risk of the risk of using the parallel of the slightly vulgar and carnal parallel of the gay community, as it's amusingly called. Why don't straight people have a community? Why don't you say so? So what's the view in the straight community of ... I don't know why people... Anyway, there's this thing of tops and bottoms, which I find completely ridiculous and nonsensical. Anyway, the idea of passive and active is an obvious thing we can sort of grasp the point of. And I think, but emotionally more importantly, there is an equivalent of that. It may be there are some 50-50 people in the world who want to give love and receive love in equal measure. But most of the problem I see amongst friends, and I've experienced amongst myself, is when people haven't accommodated the inequality that they want. They haven't understood that their partner wants to give more love and receive less, or they haven't understood that their partner wants to receive more but sort of give less. You know what I mean? And as long as they fit in what they, you know, then it's wonderful. But I think people talk about one love, but there is the need to love and the need to be loved are not the same thing. And I suppose that's, and it's working that out is part of growing up. What makes love last? I wish I knew. It can get ill and it gets better again. I suppose. I mean, you know, all the awful things, the cliches. You got to work at it. Communication, laughter. Laughter is deeply important. Realizing that flaws are to be loved rather than to be ignored or denied. You know that once you admire, and if you love someone enough, you actually love their flaws, I suppose, and you hope they love your flaws. But I couldn't claim that I have a secret as to what makes it last. Hope is another thing that makes it last. Yes, I was first diagnosed, actually not to my knowledge, as being possibly bipolar when I was about 15. I didn't know this until much later when I made a documentary about my life as a manic depressive or someone with bipolar disorder, whatever you choose to call it. An uppy-downy, mood-swingy kind of guy. In fact, technically, I believe the correct diagnosis for my condition is cyclothymic, which is like also known as bipolar light in America, which is rather nice. It makes it sound like a variety of cola. But bipolar disorder is a mood disorder rather than a personality disorder, such as that might mean anything to anybody, but I think we all kind of get what that is. To me, mood is the equivalent of weather. Weather is real. That's the important thing to remember about weather. It is absolutely real. When it rains, it rains. It is wet, you get wet. There's no question about it. It's also true about weather that you can't control it. You can't say, if I wish hard enough, it won't rain. But it's equally true that if the weather's bad, one day it will get better. And what I had to learn was to treat my moods like the weather. On the one hand, denying that they were there and saying, I'm not really depressed, because why should I be depressed? I've got enough money, I've got a job, people like me. There's no reason to be depressed. That's as stupid as saying there's no reason to have asthma or there's no reason to have a measles. You know, you've got it. You know, it's there. It's not about reason. You don't get depressed because bad things happen to you. That's getting pissed off and annoyed. That's reasonable. Someone hits you in the face, you go, ow. You know, but depression is something that happens like weather to you, inside you. And it's not about, it can be triggered by something unfortunate, but it isn't, you know, it's not enough to talk yourself out of it by saying, but I shouldn't be depressed because I've got people who are nice to me, which is frustrating for people outside who go, don't be depressed, everyone loves you, you're really happy, you've got a good life. Yeah, I know, that's what's so depressing, I can't help it. But once you, no, it's not a solution, but anyway, it's very important at least to get that stage of it out of the way, is to recognize it as a mood disorder, as something that is akin to weather. But the nature of manic depression or bipolar disorder is it's bipolar, it is two poles. It's not just depression. The point is that there is this other side to it. You have a depressed mood, you have an elevated mood, known as mania, which is the manic side of manic depression. And these are hypomanic or hypermanic states in which you can be grandiose, you can be absurdly extreme in your optimism, in your creativity, in your energy. You go for ages without sleep. You can be sexually promiscuous. You can be a shopping addict. People have different ways in which their elevated moods are expressed, and they talk 19 to the dozen. They can't stop thinking. Their mind races. They think they can solve the problems of the world. They think they have a unique insight. It can be a very blissful and exciting and extraordinary state of mind to be in. And then comes the crash. The problems of it are manifest and intense. One is that most people outside, family and friends, are more annoyed and more uncomfortable at the manic phase than at the depressed phase. A depressed person you can deal with because all they want to just sit there and they want to be in the dark in the bedroom, sleeping and not doing any work and just hating themselves. And as long as they're not, you know, really considering suicide, as long as the pain isn't that bad, then you can manage them. Whereas a person in an elevated state is just unmanageably annoying. They won't stop talking. They won't stop jigging their knees up and down and getting excited and talking about things and changing things and retidying rooms and like that. So, it can be a very frustrating for people around you. At its worst, it can be very dangerous. You can obviously suicide is the downside of depression. I had several suicide attempts in my life, but also. Really, and this always sounds like a feeble excuse, but it is true, the most natural way you would attempt to cope with something inside you that is affecting your moods and your energy levels is to intervene with chemicals to help. And because medical science hasn't come up with pharmaceuticals that do it particularly well, you tend to reach for the chemicals that are outside the pharma counter, i.e. Narcotics and alcohol. Because they can guarantee your mood, more or less. They, like the condition itself, will store up a big crash or a big reverse, but you just keep at it, and you keep getting drunk, keep getting wired, and you'll stave off the inevitable disaster of being alone with your moods. So for a long time I was, I suppose dependent is the word, on cocaine powder. And naturally, when you take a lot of cocaine powder, you tend to take a lot of alcohol with it as well. So for many years, really, I never went out without at least 4 or 5 grams of cocaine powder on my person. And I would ingest it intranasally, as was the fashion, through the use of some sort of straw or rolled up currency note, and managed to get by on it. I never did that when I was working. And, didn't do it on stage or on while filming or anything. It was a way of ending as soon as you finish, because work provided its own high, but as soon as I finished work, that was it. I was there, hours in clubs and things. I can't believe it now. I don't know how I managed to do it. It's just extraordinary. But I did. And anyway, then I had a bit of a disaster in the mid-90s. I was in a play and it just all went wrong and horrible, and I ran for the hills, as it were. Well, actually I ran for Belgium, which is not hills at all. I ran for the Low Countries. And through Belgium went to Germany, and was sort of declared missing by the British for a while, and then I was found, and it was all very ghastly. But it sort of made me confront the whole business of this diagnosis, and I saw doctors and things, and they confirmed the diagnosis. And then a few years later, when I was back on a more even keel and more used to dealing with things and a little bit more clear about myself, I made a program called Manic Depression and Me, or The Secret Life of the Manic Depressive was the proper title, and in which it was 2 one-hour films in which I went around America and England actually, talking to people with the problem, talking to doctors, talking about my own history and my own condition. And it was really interesting because it was considered something of a success, this program, and something of a breakthrough. And because aside from all the problems I've spoken about, one of the major problems is not with the person who suffers the disease, it's with the rest of the world and mental health disorder and its stigma. People just are terrible at coping with it, other people. They don't like even mentioning it if possible. I had the great pleasure of a dinner last night here in New York with Dick Cavett, the talk show host of the 60s and 70s, a brilliant talk show host. Look him up on YouTube if you don't know the shows. Just absolutely wonderful. But his career was pretty much stalled in many ways by his fight with depression, and he's written about it superbly and talked about it, and we were chatting about it last night. And it is that problem of when you say to someone, I've got a broken leg or I've got diabetes, particularly say diabetes and asthma, say, which are both chronic conditions that won't go away. People go, do you take insulin or do you take a little wheezer thing for your asthma? And you go, yes. And you say, I've got a mental health condition. They go, oh, have you? That's nice. And then they want to be somewhere else. They don't want to be anywhere near you. And I can understand that. Of course I can understand it. But you know that it's like 6 degrees of separation. I think all 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whichever. I don't think you're ever more than 3 or 4 steps away from someone close to you who has a mental health problem. And I think the more we accept that it is us, it is part of being human, then the better we are, because then we can start concentrating on the things that matter in terms of coping with it. It's a really tricky business, that of diagnosing children. On the one hand, it's very good if the diagnosis is sound and you believe in it, to spot the early signs of what could be a very difficult growing up for a child. On the other hand, to give Ritalin or powerful antipsychotic drugs to a child as young as 4 or 5. I spoke to a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University, who's one of the leading people in his field, who is quite prepared to diagnose very young children as being bipolar, not just ADHD and things that we're used to in children. And his point is that non-intervention is not a neutral act. Not giving someone drugs when you've diagnosed it is in itself allowing the brain, as he would put it, to toxify itself. That whatever is happening as the brain is forming, if it is forming in a bad way, bad pathways, bad neural signals are being sent and they're creating bad pathways, as it were, or bad demands for endocrines, because let's face it, we don't really understand that balance between hormone and encephalin, if you like, or hormone and neurotransmitter. But that's his argument, is that non-intervention allows the brain to build itself badly. But it's a heck of a thing to give a child as young as 10, or even as young as 14, frankly, some of these powerful drugs, when the brain is still growing. I find it tricky, and certainly in Europe it's considered outrageous, but it happens a lot in America. But then you have more mad people. No, I mean, sorry, you have a bigger population and better scientists. Yes, I'm always asked, what was your favourite city, what was your favourite state? City, well, I love New York, I just adore it. I do like Chicago, but I think if I could choose any city to live in, I'd probably choose San Francisco, not just because of the beauty of San Francisco itself, it's a great town, but because of its nearness to Northern California generally, and there's so much in Northern California, right up through to the Sequoia National Park, up to Oregon, the Oregon state line, and down below in also Big Sur area and the vineyards, and that part of America is just simply unbelievable. So I would probably say the favorite city is San Francisco, and maybe Northern California, if you call it a separate state. But SoCal, as they call Southern California, has its charm too. But I loved Kentucky, actually. I loved South Carolina, the lowlands of South Carolina, Beaufort. Montana takes a heck of a lot of beating just for sheer physical beauty. But all of New England is wonderful. New Hampshire, Maine people are so great. Mainers were lovely. Down east as well, which is the absolute... ironically, up east is what it really is, but it's called down east. Marvellous people, marvellous. I mean, it's just a hell of a country. It really, you've got yourself quite a nation here. The worst career advice I've ever gotten, well, is to do something because it paid more money. I mean, I know it sounds obvious and cheesy, but it's just, if you've got two jobs and one pays a lot more than the other and they seem the same, maybe you go for the one with the more money. But even then, I just think toss a coin. Because if you go for it for the more money, somehow you always end up paying more in terms of ease and peace of mind. Okay, of course, one does things just for money. And everyone knows that when you do a commercial, you're not doing it because it's a statement of personal belief. But it's a fun film. You try and choose a commercial, TV commercial that's good, is made by good, nice people, and it's a product that you're perfectly happy to be associated with. But obviously you do those in order to earn time to do other things. But no, I don't think I've ever been given disastrous advice. We've mentioned some of my heroes. Oscar Wilde is certainly one. I like people who are as unlike me as possible, which is not an expression of self-disgust or self-hatred, but it's just that, you obviously particularly admire things that you recognize yourself as not having. So ornery artists, people who speak their mind and don't care who knows it, because I fear that one of my greatest faults is my desire to please all the time and my dislike of offending people. I think it's a good thing in many ways. I'm not absolutely attacking my own instinct for politeness, but I think I admire artists who just speak out or who are strong. So it's very hard. I name them, I'll go home thinking, why didn't I name this person or that person? And obviously the usual suspects of your Mandelas and your whatnots. How can you not admire them? But also, and this will sound sentimental, people who live quiet, ordinary lives of unremembered kindness. People like my brother. I'm not saying he's ordinary, he's remarkable, but he's a reminder to me of the the virtues of being a good person. It keeps me up at night. My mind races with guilt at things I haven't done, things I've got to do. Things are always worse in the steady watches of the night, aren't they? The things you think, oh my God, I've got to do that, I've got to do that. Will I have time to do this? Oh, wow, I better set my alarm for an hour earlier to do this. And also if I've, I don't know, yeah, laziness. I still feel that I'm being watched. I mean, you know, by my grandfather or somebody who's shaking his head at me and going, you know, you let yourself down there. Who would I go to dinner with? Well, obviously Oscar Wilde. I mean, I know it's just he seems to be a theme of our conversation, but he would be a good one. I'd like to go to. And I tell you who else. I'd like to go. I'd like to meet F. Scott Fitzgerald. I mean, I love his letters. I think he writes amazing letters, and someone who's just about the best writer of his age. I think just sentence after sentence was simply perfectly made. And I just want to know how he did it. That's terrible. I just want. I mean, there are other writers who, you know, you could regard as just as great, but something about him just so technically perfect and yet so. I don't know what it is. Whenever I read a sentence of his, I think, it's so simple. There it is. It's in front of me, and all the words are easy, and yet just wow. And you know from his letters that he did work very, very hard at it, but I just want to know where it came from.